What if the path to power wasn't paved by honor, but by deception? In a world torn by treachery, war, and ambition, one man dared to redefine the rules. He didn't just study power, he weaponized it. His name still sends shivers down the spines of politicians and leaders who pretend to play fair. That man was Niccolò Machiavelli. But who was he really? A cold-hearted schemer who glorified manipulation, or a misunderstood realist who simply told the truth no one dared to hear? To understand Machiavelli, we must travel back to 15th century Florence, a city-state intoxicated with beauty, intellect, and brutality. Renaissance Italy was a paradox, the birthplace of art and science, and a battlefield for families drunk on blood and control. The Medici, the Sforza, the Borgia, they ruled not by virtue, but by fear, cunning, and the ever-changing dance of alliances. Born in 1469, Niccolò Machiavelli grew up in the shadows of power. He was no nobleman, no warlord. He was a thinker, a man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that saw through illusions. Raised during the height of Florentine chaos, he watched the city change hands, governments crumble, and promises evaporate into smoke. He was born in a world where truth was just another weapon, and trust a luxury few could afford. Machiavelli's rise began not with sword or crown, but with words. At 29, he became the second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, a position that placed him at the epicenter of diplomacy and decision-making. He met popes, kings, mercenaries. He listened more than he spoke, and he took notes. Always taking notes. But behind the polite smiles and formal handshakes, Machiavelli saw something others missed: that power belonged not to the righteous, but to the ruthless. He realized that morality was often a mask worn by those who needed to justify cruelty, that the world didn't reward the good, it rewarded the clever. It was during these years that the seeds of The Prince began to grow. But Machiavelli didn't write it as a guide for monsters. He wrote it as a survival manual for anyone willing to see the world not as it should be, but as it is. He believed rulers couldn't afford the luxury of innocence, that to govern effectively, one must learn to manipulate, to deceive, to bend ethics when necessary. Not because they were evil, but because the world itself was dangerous. And who better to teach us about that world than Cesare Borgia? Cesare. Borgia was everything Machiavelli admired and feared. A man of ambition, charisma, and cruelty. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare turned religion into a weapon and his family into a dynasty. He killed his enemies with a smile. He seduced allies and betrayed them before dawn. And yet, Machiavelli didn't hate him. He respected him. Machiavelli followed Cesare closely, even writing diplomatic reports that read more like psychological profiles. He saw how Cesare executed rivals with elegance, manipulated cities into surrender, and used fear not as a shield, but as a blade. These were not random acts of brutality. They were calculated moves in a dark game of power. From these observations, Machiavelli extracted universal principles. He distilled them into cold, hard truths. Truths like, it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. The ends justify the means. A wise ruler must not be bound by morality when survival is at stake. To many, these were the whispers of a devil. But to Machiavelli, they were reality, undeniable, inescapable. He wasn't inventing evil, he was simply decoding it. But what happens when you tell the truth in a world that lives on lies? Machiavelli's truths came at a cost. In 1512, the Medici family, exiled years earlier, returned to Florence with vengeance in their hearts. They swept away the Republic like sand in a storm, re-establishing their dominion. And those who served the previous regime, they were labeled traitors. Machiavelli was among them. He was arrested, tortured, and interrogated. Hung from the ceiling by his wrists, whipped until his flesh split. But he never confessed to treason. There was nothing to confess. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a writer, a thinker. But that didn't matter to the Medicis. Eventually released, broken and humiliated, Machiavelli retreated to his family estate in the countryside. There, in exile, surrounded by olive trees and silence, he began to write the book that would define him forever. The Prince. He wrote not from bitterness, but clarity. Alone, stripped of power, Machiavelli saw things even more sharply. He poured his insights into every page, not as fantasy, but as strategy. He dedicated the book to Lorenzo de' Medici, hoping to win favor and return to politics. But The Prince was no plea for mercy. It was a blueprint for dominion. Machiavelli laid out how rulers should act, not based on ideals, but results. He advocated for flexibility of morality, the necessity of cruelty when calculated, and the art of appearing virtuous while doing what is necessary behind closed doors. For instance, he warned against depending on mercenaries, unreliable and disloyal. He praised those who earned power through intelligence and manipulation, rather than inheritance or brute force. He taught that stability often required actions the public would never understand and should never see. And in one chilling passage he declared, "A prince must learn how not to be good, and use this knowledge when required." This wasn't advice for monsters, it was the anatomy of power, stripped of illusions. But the world wasn't ready for such candor. In the quiet corners of his exile, far from the echoing halls of Florence, Machiavelli's mind burned hotter than ever. His body may have been discarded by the political elite, but his intellect roamed freely, dissecting every structure of control, every betrayal he had witnessed, and every lie masked as patriotism. The Prince was not just a manuscript, it was a mirror held up to the political world, exposing the cracks beneath the polished marble of kingship. Machiavelli didn't invent tyranny. He recognized it. He didn't glorify cruelty. He simply explained why it worked. But his masterpiece was too dangerous to be embraced publicly. It circulated in whispered circles, condemned by some, read obsessively by others. The Catholic Church banned it outright, labeling it heretical, a guidebook for evil. But that only made it more powerful. Banned books are always read in secret, and it wasn't only politicians who turned its pages. Generals, cardinals, merchants, anyone who tasted the danger of leadership began to see the Prince as a form of armor. It didn't tell them what they wanted to hear. It told them what they needed to know. But why did this book strike such a nerve? Because Machiavelli dared to separate politics from ethics. He carved a clean line between the private morality of a man and the brutal calculus of a ruler. He argued that a leader must often make decisions that would destroy his soul, so long as it protected the state. The people didn't have to understand it. They only had to survive it, and in that claim was something radical, something terrifying. Machiavelli suggested that there was no divine plan in politics, that God was not the final arbiter of power, strategy was. He demolished the medieval notion that kings ruled by heavenly right. He replaced it with a cold, pragmatic truth. Those who ruled well ruled because they knew how to manipulate fear, loyalty, and perception. It wasn't about being born noble. It was about being useful to the moment. He admired those who could adapt, who could wear masks without becoming lost in them. The ideal prince to Machiavelli was like an actor, constantly adjusting his performance to suit his audience. He must appear merciful, faithful, and kind, while hiding the predator beneath. Consider the fox and the lion, two animals Machiavelli invoked often. The lion, bold and strong, inspires fear. The fox, cunning and clever, avoids traps. A successful ruler, Machiavelli wrote, must learn to be both. If he is only a lion, he'll be ensnared. If only a fox, he'll be torn apart. But the man who masters both traits, he becomes untouchable. This philosophy, so stark and emotionless, outraged many. To the humanist thinkers of his time, Machiavelli seemed to spit in the face of virtue. To Christian theologians, he mocked divine justice. But to the shrewd, to those who knew how fragile kingdoms really were, Machiavelli was speaking the only language that mattered: reality. Let's be honest, history is not shaped by saints. It's carved by survivors, and survival often demands acts we would rather not see. In this sense, Machiavelli was the first modern thinker of power. He saw politics not as an extension of morality, but as a game of influence, played by men with knives behind their backs and smiles on their faces. And what did that make him? A monster? Or just the first one willing to tell the truth? Even in exile, even silenced by the Medici and condemned by the Church, Machiavelli's shadow grew longer with each passing year, because his book, though slim in size, contained a kind of forbidden knowledge. It wasn't a prophecy, it was a manual, and rulers across the centuries would devour it like a map to domination. The irony? Machiavelli never returned to power. He died in 1527, politically exiled, his name whispered with disdain in public and reverence in private. But while his body was buried, his ideas refused to rest. They outlived popes, kings, revolutions, and would become the skeleton key for future emperors of influence. Fast forward through history, and you'll find echoes of the prince in every corner of power. Napoleon Bonaparte read it obsessively. He modeled his charm, military deceit, and propaganda machine on its principles. He seduced the French people with visions of liberty, all while consolidating absolute control. And when questioned, he did exactly what Machiavelli advised. He rewrote the narrative. Centuries later, dictators like Joseph Stalin and Benito Mussolini would draw directly from Machiavelli's pages. Mussolini even wrote his own version of The Prince, blending fascism with the cold realism of Florentine thought. He saw in Machiavelli a license to dominate, to crush dissent with theatrical precision. Even in democracies, leaders didn't ignore the Machiavellian code. They adapted it. Presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, even influencers, many learned to craft their image carefully, say what the people wanted to hear, and control perception with surgical intent. Machiavelli had written centuries earlier, "A prince must appear all virtue while knowing how to practice all vice." In today's terms, be charismatic, be the brand, and behind the curtain, pull every string with ruthless discipline. This isn't just political, it's psychological. Machiavelli understood something deeper than government. He understood homen, nature. He knew that people wanted to be led, that they feared chaos more than tyranny, that they would forgive cruelty if it meant security, and above all, that they loved the illusion of freedom more than the burden of choice. That's why his philosophy endures, because it isn't bound to one era. It speaks to something primal in us, something that still operates in boardrooms, battlefields, and ballot boxes. But the true brilliance of Machiavelli wasn't just in what he revealed. It was in how he packaged the truth. He wasn't emotional. He didn't beg. He presented power as a science, and he left the reader with a chilling choice: adapt or perish. So, was he immoral? Or was he simply more honest than anyone else dared to be? In the centuries that followed, scholars would split hairs over Machiavelli's intentions. Was The Prince sincere or satire? A trap for tyrants or a warning for the masses? But maybe the real answer is more sinister. Maybe Machiavelli knew that once you read the truth about power, you can never unsee it. You either become a player in the game or a piece on the board. And in this dark chessboard of history, Machiavelli wasn't a king nor a pawn. He was the hand that wrote the rules. When Machiavelli wrote that men judge more by the eye than by the hand, he wasn't making a casual observation. He was issuing a warning. What we see in a leader rarely reflects the reality beneath, and those who master this illusion rule the world. He understood a fundamental truth. People don't want the truth. They want the comfort of conviction, the appearance of righteousness, and the story they can believe in. A leader doesn't need to be moral. He needs to appear moral. He doesn't have to be good. He has to be convincing. This insight turned Machiavelli into the patron saint of deception. And The Prince became more than a book. It became a manual for masking intent. Machiavelli urged rulers to study religion, ritual, language, and symbols not for faith or tradition, but as tools. Because nothing holds people together more powerfully than shared myths and emotional narratives. A prince could do terrible things, he argued, but if done in the name of peace, tradition, or God, the masses would accept them, even praise them. The trick was to cloak brutality in benevolence. It's a tactic we've seen endlessly repeated throughout history. Think of leaders who speak of necessary wars, protecting freedom, or defending national values, while simultaneously dismantling liberties behind closed doors. These are the modern princes Machiavelli predicted. They understand the game. They know when to smile for the cameras and when to strike in the shadows. Machiavelli wasn't being cynical. He was being clinical. He wasn't urging evil. He was documenting how the performance of goodness was more powerful than goodness itself in politics. He dissected the performance of leadership the same way a surgeon dissects flesh, without emotion, without illusion, and with terrifying accuracy. He even advised that when a ruler must commit a violent act, it should be done all at once, early, in his reign, quick, shocking, and final. That way, the memory fades, and the ruler can spend the rest of his time rebuilding trust, playing the hero, and seeming merciful. To Machiavelli, it was all strategic theater. This is why so many fear him even centuries later, because once you read The Prince, you start to see the playbook everywhere. The sudden arrests for national security, the war launched to protect democracy, the law passed to keep the people safe, the charismatic speech masking a violent policy. And suddenly you realize you're not just living in history, you're living in Machiavelli's world. But here's the darkest twist. The most successful Machiavellian rulers aren't the tyrants. They're the ones who manage to convince the people that they are free, even as they quietly tighten control. Because to rule without resistance, you don't need brute force. You need belief. Machiavelli understood this long before propaganda became a science, long before media could be manipulated. He knew that the true battlefield was the human mind. Control what people see, what they feel, what they believe. And you control their actions. That's the final stage of power, not just obedience, but devotion, and that is the legacy of Machiavelli's mind games. He didn't just describe power. He exposed how it seduces, manipulates, and enslaves without chains. Centuries have passed since Niccolò Machiavelli took his final breath, yet his fingerprints remain on every lever of power. His ideas have infected empires, guided revolutions, and shaped nations. But perhaps the most chilling truth is this: his influence has only grown stronger. Today, in a world obsessed with transparency and ethics, we paradoxically find ourselves immersed in Machiavellian systems. Politicians still craft calculated personas. Corporate leaders still spin scandals into strategies. Algorithms manipulate perception, just as Machiavelli predicted rulers must do to control the masses. The language is different, the tools more sophisticated, but the game remains the same. The prince lives on in boardrooms and war rooms, in campaign trails and secret meetings. Every speechwriter who crafts just the right phrase to stir hearts. Every leader who leaks a story at the right time to shift public opinion. Every decision cloaked in virtue, hiding a brutal consequence. These are not accidents. They are plays from Machiavelli's script. And what of us, the people? We tell ourselves we are awake, enlightened, immune to manipulation. But Machiavelli would ask, are we really? Or have we simply fallen for a more beautiful illusion? His writings weren't a prophecy. They were a test of awareness, of independence, of our willingness to see beyond the theater. He offered the mask, but also showed us the face behind it. The scariest part, Machiavelli didn't view himself as evil. He believed he was helping humanity. He wanted rulers to be effective, states to be stable, wars to be fewer. His methods may have been dark, but the goal was light. He thought that by understanding how power really works, leaders could stop pretending, stop moralizing, and start governing with clarity. But can power ever be truly clean? Can a man walk through fire and not burn? Can a nation thrive when its foundation is deception? Machiavelli never answered these questions. He left them to us. He laid the truth at our feet and forced us to choose. And that is his true legacy. He does not haunt us because he was wicked. He haunts us because he was right. He stripped away the comforting lies. He exposed the gears behind the throne. He forced us to confront the terrifying idea that morality and leadership may be, at times, mutually exclusive. So, what can we take from this? What lesson remains? Perhaps it is this: in every society, there are those who wish to rule, and those who wish to believe. Power thrives when the second group outnumbers the first. Machiavelli's gift, if we dare to accept it, is not a guide for tyranny, but a lens to see clearly, a way to resist not just bad leaders, but our own desire for comfortable illusions. He taught us that the game will always be played. The question is, will you be the pawn or the player? In the end, Machiavelli was not a monster. He was a mirror, reflecting back to humanity the truth we try so desperately to ignore. We crave leaders who are kind, just, and noble. But history shows us again and again, those who rise to power are rarely the ones who fit that mold. They are the ones who understand the game, who play with masks, who win through strategy, not sentiment. So the next time you hear a speech that moves your heart, the next time a leader promises peace, justice, or change, ask yourself, is this a new dawn, or just another well-played illusion? Because in the theater of power, only one thing is certain: Machiavelli is always watching.